Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Transition Crossroad podcast, where we talk about and discuss the nuances and complexities of energy transition in Africa. This is actually the third episode, and we are so excited today to have with us a guest speaker that we believe has the robust and extensive experience to speak to this conversation. But before we dive into who the person is, we've actually crafted a very interesting topic for today's podcast that is titled Strategic Alignment, Positioning Africa to Attract Global North Investment in Renewable Energy. Actually, to speak to this conversation, it's the guest speaker, like I mentioned, that has this extensive experience. Is the person of Professor Sebastian Stel. He's an energy analyst at the European Commission's Directorate General for Energy in Brussels, where he's focused on clean energy transitioning, planning aligned with economic and industrial goals. Interestingly, he also holds a professorship role in energy meteorology at the Vrije University in Brussels. Previously, he's worked at the World Resources Institute in Ethiopia and also with the International Renewable Energy Agency in Germany, where he specialized in energy modeling for African governments. Interestingly, which is something very catchy for me, he coordinated the SPLAT model, African model for African Continental Power Systems Masterplan that was implemented by the African Union Development Agency. He's also consulted for the World Bank and the GIZ and worked across the renewable energy sector, energy systems, grid integration, climate policy, and emissions modeling. Of course, he holds a PhD in engineering science and geology and a master's degree in applied physics. And he does some really interesting things for fun. He enjoys playing the guitar and writing poetry and road cycling. So from his profile, you already know he has a lot to speak about. And I'm particularly really interested in this conversation because the essence of this podcast, like we've always done, is to synthesize new information and that will take the conversation around Africa's energy forward. So I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation. And welcome to the podcast, Professor Sebastian.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. We are most really happy to have you. So just to dive right into the conversation, first of all, I believe it's a common knowledge that Africa's clean energy transition it's vital. But also, it's also at a very pivotal crossroad where the African continent is grappling with the realities of moving towards renewable energy in such a manner that it does not impact its energy access, security, and issues of sustainability, which are I believe, are the three tripods of energy transition. Also, Africa is a hotspot for renewable energy, like we all know. We have solar, we have wind, also hydropower is there. But in all this, Africa has this abysmal clean energy investment, just 2% of global energy investment, which is not good. And this has actually been a topic of discourse for a long time. And for me, it's pretty personal for me because it's so strange that a continent that has so much also has so little. So it's on that note, I would actually want us to start this conversation from this perspective. I would actually want you to speak to this. Considering the realities on ground now, what are your thoughts on the alignment of Africa's current energy strategies to its exponential scale-up targets? For instance, Africa has this ambitious target of hitting 1,200 gigawatts of electricity by 2040, which is not far away. And this requires about $1.3 trillion of investment, which is not forthcoming right now. So looking at these dynamics, what fundamental changes will have to be made to turn these ambitious targets actually into realities on the ground?
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's a broad question, but let me try to answer as best I can. First of all, maybe two things to set the stage for the conversation in general. You mentioned that Africa requires a clean energy transition. In my opinion, most countries in Africa require an energy transition as such. Whether that be clean or not in the strict sense of the word is another question. The first and foremost priority for many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is increasing access to modern forms of energy, to electricity, but also to clean cooking and others. If that can be done in a clean way that is aligned with constraints on the global carbon budget, then so much the better. But this is not right now the priority necessarily of most countries. And if I were a policymaker in those countries, it also wouldn't be mine, I assume. There are tendencies, of course, towards a certain willingness to invest more in clean energy by certain investors. So there is a tendency to building maybe rather more solar and wind power plants than coal power plants. Those technologies have also seen their costs dropping enormously over the last couple of years, which we cannot say for fossil fuels. So there are positive signs also in that direction. But I wouldn't say that the cleanliness is necessarily the priority. Huh? And there are countries that are already running on nearly 100% renewable electricity. In most cases, that is hydropower, like in the case of Ethiopia or Guinea.
Yeah.
But the hydropower plants in those countries weren't developed because it was clean energy, but because the potential was there.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it was a resource that held enormous power in those places. So let's put that up front. The second thing I want to put up front is, in my opinion, we should stop talking so much about Africa as if it were a monotonous block. Where everywhere that you have the same problems and the same solutions to those problems.
Yeah.
As you know well, all countries have a quite different endowments, both in natural resources, but also in policy environment, in capacities, in historical experience, in access to certain resources or trade routes. So we really need to look at this country by country. That all being said, there are indeed several barriers, as you note, to scaling up investment. There's a lot of uncertainty around policies in certain countries, policy frameworks for investors. To, for example, to what extent will project developers be able and at what conditions to sell their electricity to the national electricity provider, the grid company, or to what extent is that even allowed in the policy framework of the country? Some countries are going through political turmoil, awaiting policy reforms. In some cases, there is a lack of data transparency. In some cases, there is uncertainty around how much public investment will come along with private investment. And there's also currency risk, where project developers come in and have to pay for their solar panels and the wind turbines and all the equipment in dollars, but they gain in local currency. And when that currency is subject to high amounts of inflation, for example, that destroys your balance sheets. So all of that contributes to very high costs of capital for investors, not in all countries, but in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which tends to scare investors somewhat away. So for this reason, we see that indeed, despite the enormous resources that the continent holds, the amount of investment in energy and particularly also in clean energy is a fraction of what we see in other regions of the world.
Yeah, I actually like the part where you highlighted the fact that the nuances of each of these countries are different. And also the fact that what matters most right now is actually achieving an energy access, be it overly carbonized or not carbonized. I actually did there's this report I did recently with an international NGO, with a local NGO in Nigeria, where we pointed out the case was actually specific to the Nigeria's energy sector, and we found some very interesting facts. Where we saw that, like you rightly mentioned, each of these countries have different realities. Like, for instance, in Nigeria, you see the government leaning towards the fact that natural gas is what they're looking at. While right now, then maybe in the future, we can now maybe overhaul the energy mix in such a way that clean energy plays a dominant role. And interestingly, even for the carbon intensive perspective, where maybe you're looking at natural gas and stuff like that, investment is still low. You see the problem of investment you now see that the problem of investment is not just peculiar to the renewable energy sector. You also even see the fossil fuel sectors, the investment is dropping. And interesting, it's all intermixed, because you see that a lot of investors are also laying back because of the fact that climate issues are coming up, and the investment portfolios of a lot of this, even the carbon intensive players, their investment appetite for carbon intensive projects are dropping down. So the investment problem is there. In line with what you said, that it also corroborating what you said about the fact that these investment trends are different for different countries. So it brings me to the second question, which is the problem of what is actually impacting this investment gap, looking at it holistically and also looking at it individually for each of these countries. So the question is, what do you think are the core barriers that is making these global these investors mostly in the global north holding back investment in Africa, even both for renewables and also for non-renewables? Do you think it's a challenge of maybe high cost? Because I understand, for instance, in Africa, on a general note, where you see investment in renewable energy, capital cost for renewable energy is about 2 to 3 times higher than in the global north. Um, so the puzzling question for me is, what is holding back this influx of investment into the continent?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think I can give a comprehensive answer in the few minutes that we have, but let me just highlight one thing. You mentioned indeed the cost of capital is high for investors, for project developers. That has to do with all these issues I already mentioned. So perceived risk and actual risk, and currency risk, unstable regulatory environments, maybe low credit worthiness, and so on and so forth. All that leads to high perceived risk for investors, higher in some countries than in others. Now, what is happening that is affecting in particular the clean energy investment is the following. Actually, a high cost of capital affects renewables projects a lot more than fossil fuel projects. Now, why is this? Because you always hear people talking about how solar and wind power can already, in many places in the world, produce cheaper electricity than fossil fuel projects, correct?
Yeah.
So, but that is calculated across the entire lifetime of the project. So if you count everything together, if you count together the investment in the power plant and the yearly maintenance of the plant and operational costs and the fuel costs and so on and so forth, and you look at how much does the plant produce over its lifetime, and you take into account, you get a number, a certain value of costs per unit of electricity. We call that the levelized cost of electricity. You can compare that between a solar plant and a gas power plant and say, okay, maybe the solar plant can indeed produce cheaper electricity than the gas power plant. So you could, in theory, sell your electricity from the solar plant at a cheaper rate to the off-taker to break even across the project lifetime. But that is maybe not the metric that matters the most in unstable, let's say, unstable political or economical environments, because what people are worried about there is what happens if the project fails. For example, if the project has to default because the off-taker is not paying, and there is a risk of the off-taker not paying. Now, what happens with renewables, for example, solar and wind power, is that you don't have any fuel costs, right? You don't need to buy any combustible, any coal or natural gas or anything. So almost all of your investment, almost all the money that you put into this project over the lifetime is in the initial investment.
Yeah.
That means if your project fails because the government, for example, or the public utility who was supposed to be your off-taker doesn't pay its bills, then you have lost all your investment because it was all in that initial chunk that you need to build the power plant. With a fossil fuel plant, it's not that way because the initial investment is relatively low, but you pay a lot more over the lifetime of the project because you need to buy the gas or the coal year after year. But if the project fails after a few years, then you have not yet bought all the gas or the coal or whatever, or the oil that you needed in the future. So it's actually less risky from that point of view. Because in those kind of unstable, let's say, environments with high costs of capital, I mean, an economist would say you prefer to spend your money in the future instead of in the present.
Yeah, for sure,
right?
For sure,
So this is actually one very big barrier to the deployment of renewables, of solar and wind. And this is why, despite the fact that on paper, the African continent has the best solar resources in the world and also among the best wind resources in the world, we haven't seen the investment in solar and wind power taking off in Africa in the same way that they have in other
north,
or in on other continents.
So an interesting insight for me, because it actually gives boots for me to the next follow-up question. Is the fact that if these realities are on ground, I mean these economic realities impacting renewable energy projects, are these being introduced or are these being incorporated into these into emerging projects coming up between, let's say, between the global south, for instance, like between Africa and the EU? For instance, you see you have the EU's 150 billion euros global gateway, and also the African EU Green Energy Initiative, and a couple of other just energy transition partnerships. The thing is, if these are the realities on ground, right? Are these perspectives being incorporated into such international partnerships that Africa is having with these other organizations? Because if, for instance, they are not being integrated holistically, that means a lot of these emerging partnerships or international initiatives are already are going to fail already before even starting, right? So the question is, do you see any form of mismatches or maybe missed opportunities between these international initiatives that are currently maybe coming up between Africa and the global north?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I am very happy that you used the word holistically, because I think this is indeed the key here. What do I mean with that? You know, it's not like there is no investment happening. There is investment. There are investment flows. And some countries in sub-Saharan Africa are doing better than others in this. There have been a good amount of success stories. This is true. It's not all negative. But it is true that there is a mismatch currently in the type of investment that's happening. Because, you know, let's say electricity has not only to be produced, but it also has to get to the consumer.
Of course.
And also that consumer has to be there. Right now we see that a massive chunk of the investment is being directed towards production of electricity. This is good. We need more production of electricity. It is good. But it makes no sense to produce if you cannot transport. It makes no sense to build all those power plants if there is no grid to transport that electricity to the customer. And it makes no sense to invest in all of those things if there are no perspectives to have customers. What do I mean with that second thing? Of course, the priority is for many governments is to provide access to electricity to the people that are currently in the dark, on the one hand, and on the other hand, for the country to develop economically. Why is it so difficult to provide that final energy access for the customers who are currently without electricity and who therefore cannot use electricity for productive activities and economically productive activities? Because let's say someone is without electricity, and then someone comes along and builds a distribution line to that place, to that village, for example. So suddenly there is electricity. Well, what kind of appliances are people going to use in the first months or the first years after that electricity is there? You know, light bulbs, phone chargers, radios, maybe a television, but not much more than that. There will not suddenly be huge industries growing in those locations. So for the utility company, this is not financially very attractive. There's a high cost to building the grid to get to those places that can be quite remote. And then the money you get back for that, which are the bills that the customers will be paying, are going to be relatively low because those people will not use that much electricity as compared to, you know, city dwellers, for example, in the initial stages. So how to make sure that the utility doesn't break its finances by extending electricity access to all those people waiting for electricity? Well, the way that this works traditionally is that actually most of the income of a utility company comes from a relatively small customer base, which are the big ones. Big industry. These are the ones that slurp electricity 24 hours per day, 7 days a week, that are a small amount of the customer base, but provide most of the income. This is the same whether you look at Kenya as compared to California, for example. It's no different. Now, the problem is those big customers, in many cases in sub-Saharan Africa, are also not there.
True.
So we need the production and we need the transport, but we also need the
The money.
industrialization so that there is a big customer base that can be an off-taker of that power, a backbone of the finances of the utility, so that the utility has the finances to invest in extending the grid to the people who need it. You see? So it's a package deal. It's not only production. We need to also invest in strengthening the grids, transmission and distribution grids, to get the electricity to where it should be, and attract industry to come to those places and consume that electricity.
Yeah, true. Yeah, what you just said now resonated with me, because there's this report we worked on where we found out that about I think 40 to 50% of electricity generated in Nigeria gets lost during transmission. So you see that a lot of persons are pumping money into generating electricity, and along the line they don't get it back. So you see a lot of investor apathy, which actually is killing the sector. So I do agree with that. So, but let's see it from the perspective of trying to solve the demand problem. I understand that you worked on the CPLAT project, where perspective of looking at Africa as a single electricity market. If that is the case, do you think it's possible that if indeed that project comes to light and Africa becomes a single market, do you think that can circumvent the demand problem that somewhat impacts the lack of that reduces the investors' appetite for pumping money into renewable energy investment in Africa? Do you think a single African market that cuts across boundaries can do that?
I mean, I don't think, look, a single market across boundaries is not a silver bullet that will solve all the problems. And I would argue that you probably cannot get to a single market or to a continental power system without first solving several of the problems that we've already been speaking about in this podcast. So we shouldn't see it as a magic solution, but we should see it as a pragmatic goal or a pragmatic objective to reach eventually, because we have seen from evidence elsewhere in the world that in general, building out power systems across borders covering larger geographical areas is generally helpful for increasing resilience and increasing quality of electricity delivery. Because in that way, you can combine the resources that different countries have and see import-export patterns emerging according to where is the demand, where is the supply. Some countries may become net exporters of electricity. Other countries may become net importers of electricity. But there will be dynamic patterns as well based on the seasons. For example, it's very conceivable that a country like Ethiopia, with all its hydropower, would export to its neighboring countries, Kenya, Djibouti, Sudan, and others. And they already have some of these interconnections, especially during the wet season. And that if these other countries build out a lot of solar and wind power plants, that Ethiopia would import some of that power during the dry season, or when it's dry season in Ethiopia, when solar and wind power in the neighboring countries tends to be stronger. So you will see some of these patterns emerging. And this generally is good for power system resilience. We already have other examples of this today as well. And this is not something recent. In West Africa, there are a few hydropower plants that were built by several countries together. So they are located physically in one single country, but the power is basically allocated partly to that country, but partly also to some neighboring countries who don't have hydro resources of their own.
So you mentioned hydro resources or hydropower, which actually I have a bias towards, right? The bias is the fact that it's there. Why are we not using it? I was privileged to work with someone and where we wrote about the how hydropower can actually change Nigeria's energy mix, and we found some very interesting thing. So the thing is, for hydropower, it's there, but you see the fact that I feel, although I might say it's my bias, but I feel that Africa has not actually tapped enough into its hydropower capacities. Because you see that indeed Africa is endowed with that, but you see even the countries that have these resources, especially for large dams, you see a lot of countries holding back as regards to driving, like actively integrating hydropower into their energy mix. So considering the fact that you also have experience in that sector, so I actually want you to speak to some boggling thoughts in my mind. One of them is what are the strategies you think that can ensure that large hydro projects attract funding and regional buy-in, considering obviously the environmental and social concerns, and maybe also the climate variability risk, and also the need, like you just mentioned, for cross-border cooperation. And also, how can maybe hydropower best complement solar and wind? Because of the fact that we all know that if we're talking about increasing our renewable energy, there's also the problem of intermittency, where during the day there's sun and at night there is no sun, and like you mentioned, there is also the rainy season, also dry season. So I just want to have your thoughts on the place of hydropower in the complex conversation of Africa's energy transition.
Again, it's a very good question. I'm going to make once more one remark up front, because you said that Africa's countries are not investing enough in their hydropower resources, but I would argue that there's a lack of investment in any of the energy resources. And hydropower is one of them, but it's not unique to hydropower. Now, it's true that there has been a change or a shift over the past decades in the way that hydropower projects are built. There was a few decades ago, there was what people call the global dam boom, when a lot of countries started building large hydro. So we're talking about projects like Akosombo, Lake Volta in Ghana, for example, which is massive, right? Those kinds of projects are hardly being built anymore nowadays. And there are reasons for that, which have to do with the environmental damage that they cause. So you can imagine, let's take that same example, Lake Volta. Yes, it was a boon for Ghana at the time. It powered industrial development to a certain extent, it is true. But it also flooded a massive area of the country. And nowadays, there's more consciousness about the social and environmental ecological damage that river damming and valley flooding can cause, which leads to displacement of populations potentially, which can lead to methane emissions if the area that is flooded is not deforested beforehand, for example. Or it can lead, in some cases, also to proliferation of diseases in tropical countries. If you have these artificial big reservoirs, can become breeding grounds for malaria and other kinds of disease vectors. So there are certain negative consequences associated with hydropower as a form of clean energy development. So nowadays, if you want to get funding for hydropower projects, there are several criteria that help. There is, for example, a certain appetite to invest in small hydro rather than big hydro, which may be more for small-scale electrification of villages rather than large-scale industrialization. Obviously, large hydropower plants are also still going to be necessary, but to attract investment, these projects really need to follow all the necessary due diligence nowadays in terms of meeting environmental standards and health standards, and providing socioeconomic benefits, and ideally also providing support to the energy transition by, for example, being combined with solar PV. We see a rather good amount of hydro projects now being planned with floating solar PV on the lake surface, which helps to also reduce evaporation to some extent.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for that submission. So I actually want us to circle back. There's something that has been boggling my mind. Is you mentioned from the start that Africa should focus on making energy available, not just ensuring that the energy is clean, which I believe talks about issues of complementarities. While we have fossil fuels, we should also have clean energy, like a multi-dimensional energy transition, which is something I'm really inclined towards, because the fact that it addresses the realities of the African continent and also of the specific countries. Now, the thing is, why this is an interesting take, it also has its own challenges. For instance, let's say, let's for instance, we pick a country like Nigeria, where about 75 to 80% of the energy mix is carbon based, and maybe 20% is about renewable, which is mainly hydropower. So if you want to design, let's say a lot of the power plants we have in Nigeria are base load power plants that are not too flexible for the incorporation of renewable energies. So the thing is, bringing this thing to the ground and making it work, it's not as easy as it is on the books. Also, with policies and all that, you see different. You see let's say for instance, you see the natural gas and petroleum sector not overly willing to work with the renewable energy sector. So, your quick thoughts on how do you think these things can really be? Are there policy? Is it a policy issue, or is it the fact that, let's say, it's just an age-old dichotomy between the two sectors not willing to work together? What can be done to actually make this dual reality of having a carbon-based and a clean sector work together harmoniously or an effective energy transition?
It's a good question again. I would say it starts with energy planning at the administrative level, let's say at the government level. A country needs to know what are the resources that it has, what are the resources it can import if it wants to, at what cost can it do that, what are the characteristics of those resources, what are the characteristics of demand. So, for example, in which season and which times of day is demand higher, for example, and how could those resources efficiently work together to meet that demand. And for this reason, in many of the projects that I've worked, strengthening the capacities of governments to engage in science-based energy planning was at the forefront. In order to be able to draw up strategies for what kind of resources should the country ideally want to develop over the coming years and decades. Usually, diversified strategies tend to work out relatively well. We can see, for example, in recent examples from Southeastern Africa, in Zimbabwe and Zambia, there's been a quite heavy drought, or a sequence of dry years actually recently, which impacted hydropower generation very negatively, leading to electricity crisis. Another country that also saw these drought patterns, but that didn't suffer from the negative consequences in the electricity sector was Kenya, because it had already diversified its electricity mix, because they already have geothermal and solar and wind next to hydropower, for example. So there is a role for all these resources to play, usually in a reliable and affordable electricity mix, but it needs to be planned. There needs to be there needs to be data and science behind it. And then you will see that some countries can continue relying on hydropower as they've done in the past, and can use that hydropower to add more solar and more wind. You will see that other countries will require very likely more natural gas in the near future to power increasing demand, and also to support a transition towards more renewables. We will see that other countries like South Africa, for example, will continue to phase out coal, while looking strongly at other renewables to make up that gap alongside storage systems and so on. So, as I said in the beginning, every country will have its own specific pathway to take, and its own specific realities to face. But it starts with energy planning.
Yeah. So the conversation has been really interesting for me. I believe it's actually giving to the facts, to the realities on ground, because of the fact that there is so much in this space, and there is so much information, and it's difficult to pinpoint what should be done. I think this conversation, has really been informative for me, and I think it's also going to be informative for a lot of persons also within the sector. So I want to thank you for being on the podcast. We're already running out of time. I feel if we should have this conversation, we can have this conversation for a whole day, because the more we dig, the more we see the need to dig. Yeah, so thank you, Professor Sebastian, for being on this podcast. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope the conversation continues, and maybe along the line, you'll be also another guest. You'll be a guest of another episode of the podcast.
It'll be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.